And we made this point earlier, but I want to read this excerpt because this really caught my eye. Is that, well, I'll read the excerpt first. So he says, quote, in distinct contrast to the limited warfare of the ancient regime, then the new era of democratic Republican warfare, which began with the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, which is further exhibited during the 19th century by the American War of Southern Independence, and which reaches its apex during the 20th century with World War I and World War II and continues to the present, is the era of total war. That entire era of total war he just described was facilitated by fiat currency. And this really caught my eye because, again, when we're talking about blurring the lines between public and private property or violating private property rights, like that's all fiat currency inflation is, like full stop. It doesn't do anything else except violate the property rights of those depending on it to hold value, allocating those rights to those who can print the money effectively. So it's like democracy itself has distorted this relationship, but fiat currency is just like gasoline on the fire.
And that's something that tends to happen more in democracies, I think.
Yeah.
Although, to be fair, like World War I, there were monarchies that were inflating away, and usually that was a tool that they felt like they needed to use because the other side was using it, and that was the only way they can really keep up. But getting back to this earlier point about total war. It is enabled largely by some sort of like ideological reason, right? Which is more endemic to democracies, and fiat money, which does tend to happen more in democracies. But I think the God thing definitely is there too. Like there's a reason I think he chose the French Revolution, because that was the first sort of like atheist regime. And we saw the reign of terror, like just beheadings left and right, and killing of all sorts of people. And what a lot of these have in common, aside from the U.S. Civil War, and there's a lot of people that think Abraham Lincoln was actually more of a deist or theist than a Christian, say. Is this idea that you remove like a higher power from the equation, and you get sort of like this ideology as your higher power. That becomes the all-consuming thing. And like the French Revolution was absolutely crazy, right? Like they changed the names of the months. They tried to remove like absolutely everything monarchical. They had 10-day weeks for a while there, and like just they changed up everything that they could think of because they were rejecting everything that came from the past. And obviously it wasn't very Lindy, like them trying to do that. And that ended up, like with all sorts of unforeseen problems, and part of why the French Revolution just lasted so long and it was so chaotic. But, World War I, World War II, they had an element of, ideology and a rejection of God in it, particularly World War II, because that was where you had an atheist Stalin with very pagan, I would say more Nietzschean, Hitler. Like his whole thing was about force of will and things like that. That they were the main players in this whole drama. And they ended up like just, killing enormous amounts of people as a result. And that total war, I agree. Democracy definitely fuels it because of the ideological nature. And of course, fiat money definitely fuels it. But there's also a third part of this trinity, and I think that's the rejection of God. I would call this like the evil trinity of factors that sort of lead to this complete war that, that's pretty terrible.
Is that then, this seems like kind of a post-Enlightenment apex type of thing, right? Where we really started to, start the scientific revolution through that process. And that has kind of diverged a lot of people's belief systems or identity from God and towards something much more rational, like I don't want to say rational. Let's just say atheist, logical. Is there is this just something we have to go through to bring that back, to kind of like rediscover the benefits of ancient wisdom in some way? Or are we just going to kind of, in your opinion, hopelessly keep careening away in this away from God in this scientific revolution?
Yeah, well, I'll answer a more specific question first with regard to war. So, are we going to prevent some of these wars? I think the point at which, war kind of stops are there are two sort of like steady states. Either no one has weapons, or everyone has weapons. So, in a situation, there's a reason you haven't seen war between major powers in a while, because they all have nuclear weapons, and like this is like guns times a million, right? Because you just press a button, bam, you can destroy entire cities and so on. So wars right now are mostly waged between either two non-nuclear powers or a nuclear power versus a non-nuclear power, right? At least one of the parties has to be that way. And total war isn't, like, in a sense that kind of happened in Iraq, although like we completely screwed up and, did get Saddam out of power, but there was never, ever going to be any sort of negotiated settlement. And that's a negotiated peace is just like hasn't happened, right? In like 100 years. Like, you don't stop a war because like, unless you're like non-nuclear powers or something like that, or you have some sort of dictatorship. You don't have a negotiated peace anymore. It's, the regime has to be toppled, it has to be destroyed or something. And this is sort of the effect of total war, is that needs to happen in order for war to end. So the stakes are still fairly high. But like the thing about the question that you're asking is, is it possible for us to sort of like go back towards that because we're seeing how terrible it is? I don't think it's gotten bad enough yet, honestly. Like, we're happily sitting at home, even though we're locked in our homes, many of us, we can still go play video games on the computer and, shit post on Twitter or something, like you can. It doesn't hurt enough where it's, that sort of thing is going to actually help. I think there's sort of like a quiet desperation in a lot of people's lives. And maybe that is ultimately what drives people towards, embracing God again and things like that. And there's epidemic levels of depression and suicidal thoughts and suicide and things like that. But that I think is more the thing. But the actual practical consequences of war are largely abstracted away. They're mostly fought by professional fighters. Conscription hasn't really happened since Vietnam, and that left a very traumatic sort of scar, at least in the American psyche. I'm sure conscription goes on in other places around the world, but wars are somewhat limited due to nuclear weapons. It might be one of the most like. It kind of has brought peace in many ways and encouraged more trade. Like people tend to like demonize nuclear weapons, but because it's so powerful, right? It sort of equalized things a lot. There's a reason we're not invading North Korea or doing anything like that. It's because they have nuclear weapons. And in that way, it's kind of like guns, right? Because guns made it so that a professionally trained soldier and you are, not that far apart, right? Like
symmetry of
even
violence
things out
kind of thing.
And, swords did the same thing, right? Like it used to be that people that could punch harder, could like beat up a lot more people. But, you have swords now, it's a lot more even. Guns did the same thing. Nuclear weapons have done the same thing sort of at a macro level. So in that sense, it's brought about peace. And I think that's something that like Hoppe doesn't get into. But that said, it does make it a lot more fragile, because if you do get into a nuclear war, now everything is wiped out. So I don't know if it's better or worse, but I will say that it has sort of like prolonged the period of peace, especially in the Western world. And I'm not talking about the Middle East or South America or Central Asia or something like that. But it has kind of made things fairly peaceful and encourage trade in that way. So, give it up for nuclear weapons, I guess.
Not a direction I thought we would go today, but that does make a lot of sense. And yeah, it comes down to symmetry, right? When something Saylor said to me a long time ago, he goes, everyone in Miami Beach is very polite to one another because the gun laws are very laxed. He's like, so, people just operate under the presumption that everyone's armed. So therefore people are very polite. There's a lot of symmetry there. That makes sense to me. How do you, I know this is a big question. We could spend days on it, but how do you think Bitcoin plays into all of this? Do you think, it seems like larger institutions are being more or less economically forced to adopt Bitcoin. I don't want to say forced, it's not actually coerced, but they're just in pursuit of their own self-interest to preserve wealth over time. You end up having to seriously evaluate and ultimately adopt Bitcoin, in the opinion of most Bitcoiners, including myself. Presumably that would eventually happen at kind of the geopolitical scale. Do you think this becomes a significant deterrent to warfare? We know it would reduce the nation state's ability to finance warfare through inflation. Do you think there are other implications of that?
Well, that's a big one though. Like that would be the main thing is the fiat money's ability to finance war. So the past, I guess 42 years of our adventures in the Middle East, ever since the embassy storming in Iran up until, the recent stuff with Afghanistan, I had Scott Horton on my podcast and we talked about like all the things that went wrong and all the stupidity of the US foreign policy that led from one thing to the other. Like the Iran-Iraq war happened because of, we were backing Saddam because we were pissed off at Iran for taking our hostages. And that led to Iraq getting in debt, and that led to them, going and invading Kuwait, and that led to us invading Iraq, and that led to us establishing air bases in Saudi Arabia to enforce no-fly zones in Iraq, and that led to Osama bin Laden getting pissed at us because we had, U.S. air bases in a holy peninsula, according to his religion, and that led to him doing 9/11, and that led to us invading Afghanistan, that led to us invading Iraq. It's all connected, right? It's all like sort of like one disaster after another. And we're involved in like 6 different wars right now, including Yemen and Syria and Lebanon and all these places, and Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously. And all of that is all related, right? It was like just, unintended consequence after unintended consequence. And a large part of that is fueled by fiat money. And it's a lot of that, if you read his book enough already, it's about, keeping the petrodollar as well. And, satisfying the Saudis, who are a big sort of like supporter of the petrodollar. And if we didn't have their support, and this is why we're in Yemen, right? Because they're like, hey, we want to invade Yemen and you're going to help us out. And it's like, okay, because, we they're against Iran because one's they're Shiite and, Iran is Shiite and, Saudi Arabia is Sunni. And they were pissed at us for like essentially supporting Iran by taking over Iraq and making them that a sphere of influence. So this was our concession to them, something like that. So,
and one question. So we need Saudi support for the petrodollar so we can keep pricing oil contracts in dollars. Is that right?
Yeah, well, to keep the dollar as a world reserve currency. So, I mean, there are different opinions on this, but I think it's at the backbone of why the dollar is the world reserve currency. Is the fact that you need it in order to trade for oil. And if Saudi Arabia started selling oil for euros or something like that, I think it would it would change the international dynamics very significantly. Right. And it would take like 20 or 30 years, but I think whatever they priced it in would compete with the dollar as global reserve currency. Right. That is like outside of a Bitcoin world. Now, what does Bitcoin do? Well, Bitcoin, takes out a lot of this war stuff. You can't fund $1 trillion Iraq war, just out of thin air, like we did. And you would have to explicitly tax because you still have to pay soldiers, you have to pay for weapons, you have to pay for all that stuff. I suspect that the lower hanging fruit is probably making the military a lot more efficient. So if you study like military spending, defense spending and stuff like that, they spend so much money on weapons that don't work, which is like, are you serious? Like we spent how many millions of dollars on like this weapon system that doesn't do anything or whatever. And it's like, they try it, it doesn't work, or there's like a very easy way to get out of it or something like that. And they spend so much money on just crap like that they could probably take out, and that would be a large this is essentially funding defense contractors, by the way. Right. And they're a big part of like the military industrial complex, but drawing down the military industrial complex will probably get them a lot more savings, and maybe they wage war maybe a little bit more efficiently and still pay soldiers and pay for gas for tanks and things like that. And, all the stuff that they do just through tax revenue. But, longer term, I think ultimately what it does is it makes the apparatus of government, the cost of defense a lot clearer because, it's largely abstracted away from us through inflation. And I saw a budget once about, like the US budget, and you look at all the line items and you have defense spending, which comes in at like 30 or 40% of spending. But there's a lot of other stuff like veteran affairs and, other things which are related to defense, but aren't counted as part of defense spending. And if you add up all that ends up being like 50%, right? Like, and the other like 45% is entitlement. So really, like, you take out those two things and you have a lot more money. It's just the way that the government spends money is just insanely inefficient. So I think Bitcoin sort of like pops the pin a little bit because you're not going to be able to inflate as much. I think central banks start realizing that, there are two scenarios. It goes into hyperinflation and then they adopt the Bitcoin standard, or their central banks start becoming a lot more tight with their monetary policy. Right. And that controls budgets as well, because you can't sell treasuries if there's no lender of last resort. So, there's a couple ways. Either way, I think what you end up with is you shrink the military industrial complex. Yeah. And that means less war, at least in the US. Globally, hopefully what Bitcoin does is, instead of ideological wars, maybe you have a certain economic wars, like, I think Russia's actions with Crimea were something like that. It was economic. I think there's a large oil field there and stuff like that. So it was important to keep them there. There's a lot of, those kinds of wars, at least I can understand that they tend to be fairly limited. And, those are kind of what we have because of nuclear weapons, although wars of ideology still do happen. But yeah, I I don't think war ever really goes away, but it does change its nature. And, maybe with clear property boundaries going forward. Although, I don't know, like I am in favor of smaller states, and I think they are kind of inevitable once the dollar collapses. So in that way, you might have smaller skirmishes, but they would be done in a limited way, because it's not going to be popular in any place where you're having war, because people would much rather have prosperity. Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. So much smaller, maybe more frequent local skirmishes instead of World War I, World War II type dynamic. Yeah. That makes sense. So let me ask you maybe a slightly more metaphysical type question related to the same topic. Is it possible that Bitcoin, because a lot of what we've talked about today is this lack of clarity with property is leading to all of these distorted outcomes, this destruction of private law discovery, the shift towards public, what do you call it? Positive civil law, more warfare, more ideological possession. All of these negative consequences seem to be largely derived from the lack of clarity related to property, basically. So do you think it's possible that Bitcoin, by clarifying not only the boundaries of private property, because it's very clear with Bitcoin, right? You either have the keys or you don't. There's no public property BS associated with it. But perhaps also clarifying the importance of property. Like even this discussion we're having today, I think it's sort of reinvigorated this discussion about, you could say the founding principles of the US, or it even goes back further than that, into the Magna Carta. They talked about the inviolability of property, things like this. Is it possible that Bitcoin, by clarifying the importance and boundaries of properties, could dispel our susceptibility to these ideologies that have taken us down paths of self-deception?
I certainly hope so. And it's strange because, we think ourselves as extremely vulnerable to propaganda, because we've been subjected to it for so long. But I mean, even 150 years ago, it was fairly clear to everybody that like money printed out of nothing was, a violation of property rights. It's only because we've grown up in public school and been taught certain things that we don't recognize them as such. So property rights, I think, are very core to the human experience. And it's something that we naturally kind of know. It's that we've unlearned it because of school, right? Like, and to some degree, I think we all instinctively know it, despite, whatever communists even will say. Like, you steal a chicken from a communist, they're still going to get angry, right? That's how it is. So I suspect that this, Bitcoin does sort of give cleaner edges to property, and does sort of like bring property back, and maybe even enhances property, because it's metaphysical property. It doesn't have a physical form or location. So it is very difficult to confiscate. And it's even clearer with Bitcoin what you own versus something like gold, where if you're storing at a gold depository who actually owns a gold bar, well, you're actually loaning it to them in exchange for a claim or something. Like it gets all complicated, and you get much clearer boundaries because of its digital nature. The clarity is off the charts. It's even clearer than monarchy versus democracy or whatever. The boundaries are much better there. Now, does that eliminate public property? I don't know. I think people like the idea of public property because it's, in a sense, their substitute for actual community. Like most people aren't in many communities today. And if they are, it's like just online or something like that, or Facebook, and that's just a community, right? That's a real community,
right?
But we're wired for a community. We're wired for a small group, a village, something like that. And there's Dunbar's number, I think, which is like 158 or something like that, the maximum number of people that you can know in a group before you start forgetting their names and stuff like that. That's kind of how we're wired. So if we're not in a community like that, there is a search for something else, and that I think ultimately leads to some of this desire for democracy or something bigger than yourself that through that's sort of like the security hole through which a lot of these ideologies and evil things come through. Yeah, especially go ahead.
So you're back to the loss of religion in a way, right? People trying to fill that void with public property or something else.
Yeah, it's a psychological thing in a sense. Like there's something missing in their life, and it is community or society or people that you're a part of. And if you don't have that, you're going to look for it in something like my country or my party or my some sense of belonging. And I mean, to be fair, I think part of the Bitcoin community is like that, right? Like it's sort of LARPing on what a real community should be, which is usually local and growing up in a village or something like that. And there's a disconnect between how we live and how we're wired. So that's the hole through which public property, this anathema, comes through.
Yeah, that's a great point. It seems to me almost like, to your point, we're wired with these limitations like the Dunbar number, but the very thing that makes human beings the dominant species in the world, as Harari pointed out in Sapiens, is that we can cooperate flexibly in large numbers. And we do that through the use of symbols, right? I think he calls them the imagined orders, like nation states, civil liberties, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like to be human, we need some symbol, like to coordinate ourselves beneath. Right? The Dunbar number is not enough. There needs to be some higher order symbolic or moral system that we organize ourselves within. And I guess historically, that was religion. And now we've kind of had these experiments recently where it's, let's try communism or let's try democracy. These different ideologies that have tried to act as a substitute. But we can't not have it, right? There has to be some organizing principle that's superordinate to the Dunbar number.
Yeah, and I think libertarians would say natural law is a good substitute. Like a natural, like it's not exactly religion, but it's something that at least people can agree to and say, okay, these rights exist, and that's the organizing principle, that you protect individual liberty rather than sort of collective something or other, right? And that's the organizing principle, I think, works a lot better, at least from an a priori perspective, because if you are catering to the individual, then they are naturally going to do certain things that that help build civilization, as opposed to sort of like trying to subject other people to the will of the state, which is more or less where you end up if going down that path from earlier. Like you're a sovereign individual, then you have representatives to protect your rights, to you have you want to do the most good for most people, and then you're a slave to the state, right? Like those are by steps kind of where you end up. So having an organizing principle, I think, is definitely necessary, and natural rights seem like a pretty good option. And that's kind of what the U.S. was originally founded on. Yeah, exactly. Unfortunate that it's no longer.
Yeah. To the point you said earlier too, that we've had these ideals for a long time, but the implementation has always failed, right? They've been scribbled down on a piece of paper that we could adhere to or not. Something like the Constitution or Magna Carta. That's really interesting. Do you think then that this perhaps explains why Bitcoin kind of generates its own religious like fervor, and that people are just finding this as a larger symbol to organize themselves within?
Yeah, so Bitcoin is a symbol of sort of like verifying, not trusting, sort of like self-sovereignty in some ways, especially financially. I, I don't know if there's necessarily like I guess there is kind of an ideology there with like Bitcoin maximalism or something to that effect, that you can kind of describe. And
it's kind of natural law, right?
Yeah, kind of. It's it's don't steal from people, right? Like, which is what altcoins do, and so on. But yeah, there is something to that, and I don't think we've studied this enough to really have, or at least I haven't studied it enough to really make a definitive statement on whether or not this is ultimately where it's going to end up. I do think, though, that Bitcoin definitely affects a lot of aspects that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So a lot of Bitcoiners go work out a lot more often, and have more kids, and
eating healthy,
and maybe even exploring religion and things like that. Like there's things that Bitcoiners do that other people don't, and there is some sort of organizing principle that's there. That I'm not. I guess the closest thing to it would be verify, don't trust. And it is kind of new in the sense that most people are very used to trusting, and it is kind of counterintuitive for people to have to go verify something on their own. But that is sort of like the organizing principle around why like people start eating like meat or things like that, because they realize, okay, if I actually verify all of the studies that say cholesterol is bad for you, I find out that it's a lot of BS. Or that lockdowns are actually slowing down the spread of COVID. I find out that it's BS or something like that. Verifying on your own is a very different thing than trusting, and there does seem to be maybe that principle at work here.
And then, just to tie this back to Democracy, the God That Fell, clearly Bitcoin has a influence on lowering your time preference. Do you think that it could be, I mean, maybe not the symbol we organize ourselves under, but just a contributor to this civilizing force that is a lower time preference?
Yeah, so I would say that lower time preference is, what Christians call prudence. It's a virtue, and virtue comes out of aligning your behavior with your beliefs. And the belief there is that long term, I am going to prosper by doing like planning for the future and giving up things now. And that alignment takes some amount of effort to do. Like a lot of people, for example, have trouble losing weight, even though they know that losing weight would be a good thing for them, and that it would help them physically and many other things. But the act of the virtue itself is aligning your actions with your beliefs and making sure that you feel good when you're doing the right thing instead of feeling bad. So that's what I would call low time preference behavior. It's ultimately a virtue, and it's behavior based. The belief under it is that sort of like symbol or whatever. And it for whatever reason, verifying, not trusting does lead to this virtue of saving up stuff for tomorrow and things like that. And Bitcoin obviously has this store of value property and this enormous return on saving that we haven't had, which does sort of do that. But it's a virtue that you get as a result of Bitcoin, and not necessarily like you're attracted to Bitcoin because you have that virtue. Does that make sense? It's the effect, not the cause. Yeah,
it seems like Bitcoin might be the most practical implementation we've had for inspiring prudence in a lot of ways.
Or the best, it's got an obvious payoff to prudence. Whereas most, at least in the fiat system, you often don't have that payoff, right? Like for character and things like that, I think prudence is still good, even if you're saving dollars, right? Like because you're learning to sort of deny yourself and things like that, which is a necessary part of being an adult. But like the payoff on holding dollars or saving dollars is terrible. And so practically speaking, the rewards aren't as great as the sacrifice you're making. So there's a tendency not to do that. Whereas with Bitcoin, the rewards are enormous and the sacrifice isn't nearly as much as the reward that you're going to get. So that I think does inspire virtue, and that's a good thing. That like whenever there's more virtue, you're going to get more civilization built, better people, more character, just all sorts of good things.
That's really fascinating. Just this connection again, like the clarity of property, precision of property, and the inspiration of virtue. That's really positive way to look at Bitcoin. Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services, or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. We'll jump back in here, and maybe it would make sense now to take a look at a bit of the 20th century and how some of this actually played out. So we talked about World War I and World War II being kind of the apex of the warmongering that a democratic state causes. What happened in World War I and World War II? I think the author goes into some of this change in governance systems around the world. Where should we chart our path here?
Yeah, so I think basically what Hoppe says is, all of, especially post World War I, all of the monarchies essentially disappeared. They went and established democratic republics, universal suffrage, parliamentary, legislatures and things like that for almost all of them. And the few monarchies that remained were symbolic in nature. So you had the Queen in England and things like that. So that I think is reasonable, right? Like that happened in large part because of Woodrow Wilson, who made it an explicit goal to make the world safe for democracy, and because his influence sort of his decision essentially to bring the U.S. into World War I ended up winning the war for the Allies. He did get to set a lot of the terms. And, like France, post French Revolution was, headed towards democracy direction anyway, with many false starts and so on. But like all of the losers, basically, it was a total war. So they lost everything. And, the victors could essentially impose whatever. And that's what they did. They Austria, Germany, and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire was like 7 different states after that, right? It turned into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and several others. But it became, like all of them essentially became quote unquote democracies. What's interesting about that is that didn't really stop the total war. And this was sort of like Woodrow Wilson's thing, is that we make the world safe for democracy, we could have this thing called the League of Nations, and this would be the last war we ever fought. Actually ended up the opposite. We had World War II, which was an outgrowth of World War I, largely due to reparation payments and so on that were required. And of course, Russia was absolutely crazy, and all the stuff that they did to their people. And Stalin had some territorial ambitions, so he took advantage of, the things that were going on. So World War II ended up being an even more devastating war than World War I. And once again, because Roosevelt came into the war, the American public at that time was like extremely against the war, by the way. There's this sense that it was, the American public would support it and everything else. Actually, the American public was pretty angry at the allies at the time, which were Great Britain, to some degree, Russia, and they basically, Great Britain had not paid back the debts from World War I, and neither did Russia. So that was a big sore point, especially under what was then a gold standard, at least in the United States. That was a big deal, right? Like, it's like, okay, they squelched on their debts and they never paid it back. At least Great Britain did pay back the debts for World War II, which I think the last payment was in 2006. Russia never paid back debts for World War II either. I think it got like written off at like 1% or 2%, 2 cents on the dollar, something like that.
Wow.
But all of that meant that Roosevelt had to, really work. And this was like a big use of propaganda in order to basically bring the US into this war. And some of that persists to today. We tend to think of Hitler as the worst possible imaginable evil. I would argue that Stalin was worse, but not a lot of people sort of think that way because, of course, Stalin was our ally in World War II. But after post-World War II, because of Roosevelt's influence and his ability essentially to bring in the winning part of the war, meant that he got to dictate at least some of the terms for Western Europe, at least. Eastern Europe became pretty much all communist, but Western Europe, stayed, all democracies, and that led to kind of what we're seeing today, and what I think we're going to talk next about, which is the welfare state, which has been a feature of democracies, and a large part of that, of course, is the fact that everyone gets to vote, and this is kind of what the founding fathers of the United States were kind of really worried about. It's mob rule. It's like, if I could vote for myself to get lots of money, then yeah, I'm going to do it, and that seems to have been the case lately. Post World War II. That's been the trend in every democracy, is towards more social services, more welfare. We talked about welfare and warfare state. Warfare was certainly like peaked, at World War II, though it's by no means like ended. But welfare has also increased significantly in every country, even as technological process gives us more prosperity.
Yeah, it's interesting. So was Wilson then? He's effectively exporting democracy via force in a way. What was the impetus for that? Was this just, we had this model in our country and we just needed to replicate it?
Yeah, so I've been studying him a little bit, and you have to recognize that he came out of an academic background. So he was a college professor, and he was a professor at Princeton, and he had a gift for oratory. And this is something that I've noticed about sort of the 20th century, and especially with the advent of propaganda. It tends to lift up people that can speak well, right? Not necessarily the people with the best ideas or the best administrators or anything like that. And those people are the ones that tend to come into power. Woodrow Wilson being one of the chief ones. Hitler, another one. He was apparently this amazing speaker that could like hold the crowd spellbound for 4 hours at a time. So, that has tended to be the case in democracies. During his professorship at Princeton, he was able to, basically hold these large lectures and things like that. And he became very popular, and they decided to make him the college president. And he was college president. He had all sorts of conflicts. The reason, by the way, why Princeton doesn't have a large graduate school is because of him. He refused, even though he had like this large gift that he would be able to, in order to start a graduate school. And it was like, no, we're not going to do that. And he had his own petty reasons for doing that. There was like a rival that would have been in charge of it, and he didn't want that person to get power or whatever. But anyway, he was a very good speaker. So, the Democrat Party, having run William Jennings Bryan for like a bunch of elections and they kept losing. They were like, okay, let's bring this guy or we need a better guy. And they started looking. He was he became governor of New Jersey, by the way, at that time. So he sort of came onto the national scene because he was just so good at speaking, and that was his like sort of superpower. So he had all of these ideas, like going into office. By the way, he ran on not bringing the United States into a European war. So he completely lied. But he always had at his head, like he wanted to be on the world stage. So his ambitions, like as he became, president of Princeton and then governor of New Jersey and president of the United States. And, at that time, U.S. was still not quite a superpower, right? They were, on the world stage, but he wanted to raise the prestige of the United States and raise his own profile. And he thought he could be that guy. Like nowadays, like you're president of the United States, you're sort of seen as the leader of the free world. Back then, at least under his watch, U.S. was much more of an isolationist country and just sort of didn't involve themselves in anything else other than some stuff in South America and stuff like that. So it was, they like the European powers didn't really respect the U.S. quite as much, and he wanted to bring up that profile. So his involvement in World War I was largely like sort of a lot of European powers like sort of playing to his ego a little bit because they needed his money. The U.S. was rich. They were the nouveau rich of the international community. And of course, they needed the loans. France and England in particular got a ton of loans from the United States. Like I said, they squelched on some of that. And even Russia got some of that, as part of the alliance. So he wanted to raise the profile of the United States. He wanted to raise his own profile. And, his big idea was this League of Nations. And he basically gave away the store and let the French and the English dictate what the peace terms would be after they won the war, because he wanted this League of Nations so bad. The irony, of course, was that the U.S. Senate rejected the League of Nations. So the United States wasn't a part of the League of Nations. And it ended up just being like a victors club anyway. Like none of the defeated nations actually got to join. So, he was this sort of like tragic comic figure who had this one superpower of being able to speak well. But he wasn't intellectually deep, and he had, he kind of like broke a lot of the traditions of the United States. Like again, the U.S. was an isolationist country and known as that for a long time, right? And this had a very strong tradition, like going back to George Washington, like we're not going to be in European affairs. And he broke all of that. He was, I think, the first president to leave U.S. soil during his presidency. No other president before that did that, because it was so important that they focused on domestic stuff instead of foreign policy. And he's really the first president to make foreign policy like a big thing. And, ever since then, it's been like a big part of every president's, legacy, basically. And, starting to intervene in foreign affairs, basically. So, this was his way of raising the U.S.'s and his own profile. And that's essentially what happened post-World War I. It was his way of enforcing, Pax Americana, I guess. And of course, it wasn't really that peaceful, but that was the idea. Yeah.
That's interesting. So the oratory being the gift that elevated a lot of these leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Because I watched that World War II in color on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen that yet. It's a documentary.
Oh yeah, I've seen parts of it. Yeah.
Do you remember seeing the scenes of Mussolini?
Yeah.
He is so like, it looks like almost a parody you would see on a movie of a dictator. Like he just makes these very extreme facial expressions, and he's very animated, let's say. But I wonder how much, because that was when television and radio was becoming the media, the dominant media of the world. So I wonder how much of that, again, we talked earlier about how the technological realities kind of shape the outcome. So it's like all of a sudden we have television and radio as the dominant modes of media. So these guys that speak really well, or in Mussolini's case, speak very animated, that contributes to their success politically.
Yeah, well, just as a public speaker, and I think you know this too, like if you're on stage and unless there's a camera trained on you and there's like a big screen behind you of your face or something like that, you can't make subtle gestures in front of a crowd. You have to be animated, right? Like and every expression has to be very obvious to the crowd. Otherwise, they're just not going to get it. If it's on television, it's a little different, and like subtle movements are what you want on television, but on stage in front of a crowd, you have to make everything obvious. So I kind of understand where Mussolini's coming from and sort of being very animated. I think Hitler was very similar in that way too. And you know, essentially these guys were actors, right? And Roosevelt too, to a large degree, right? Like his ideas were super thin, and he had like almost no mind of his own, and like he was heavily influential. But the thing that he had was his gift for oratory. He would be able to go on radio and basically say something, and it would just sound so comforting because he had this like amazing like uncle voice that like everyone could listen to and just say, wow, this guy really cares, and everything else. And that was sort of what propelled him. And there is a technological aspect to it, in that like radio, especially around World War II, was like a part of everyday life basically by then. And of course, television, I think starting in the 60s, became an even bigger part of how people saw things. But this was again there because of the propaganda aspect of it. There was so much more at stake, and these tools got used because of this need to get the compliance of everybody else in a democracy. And you don't necessarily need that as a monarch. So like monarchs weren't really actors, right? Like they just did whatever it was everyone else that had to act to them. Whereas, the dynamic is completely turned around in a democracy where, you have to get the consent of the people. So you have to have like fiery rhetoric or something to like incite their emotions. And it became like actually very, very emotional during that time. And still is to a large degree, right? Like the easiest way that politicians manipulate you is to get you to feel something. And if you do, then you're putty in their hands, basically.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost like, again, back to property, when the democratically elected ruler has to sell you on something, right? He's trying to sell the war or sell the tax bond or the war bond or whatever it may be. So they have to just put some more sauce on it, right? They have to act a little, just to a greater degree. So that's interesting. And then the monarch, though, it just doesn't have the same incentives, right? It's just, it's his business. It's his property. He's going to do whatever he wants. And your opinion doesn't matter nearly as much because he's not elected and he's not really violating your property. I mean, I guess he is to some extent, but it's it's a different form of taxation, right, than what we're accustomed to. That's all really interesting. And then, so
well, can I point out something? Because you just triggered a thought. I think CEOs are kind of walking down that same path right now, right? Like it used to be that no one cared, right? Like you have people performing for CEOs because they want a prestigious job or their account or something like that. But like as these companies become much more public and zombie companies or whatever, they're having to become more performers, right? Like they're having to have charm and like public persona and stuff like that. So I wonder if like, as you become more public, you just sort of have to go down that direction where, you don't have great operators at CEO positions as much as you have great actors, right? Like people that can perform certain things. And that seems to be the direction we're going. I mean, you still have to have confidence, but, they're becoming kind of politician-y.
Right. No. And again, taking it back to property, like the only way a zombie company can't exist, which again, we'll just, I guess define a zombie company. It's the way I define it is a company that's generating losses. It's not a profitable company ostensibly, but it is subsidized by tax revenues, right? So it's a company that would not exist absent the coercion of taxation and or inflation. So they're benefiting from suckling at the teat of the state effectively. And so again, where private property gets blurred into public property, they benefit from that. So then they become more disingenuous or deceptive, maybe in their leadership role. That's a really interesting dynamic. I'd love to parse that out some more.
Yeah, I mean, the person that comes to mind immediately is Elon Musk, right? Because he's performing for the public now, right? Like instead of sort of just, like in a sense, because Tesla is such a public stock, and he knows that government regulatory stuff is very important, and of course he's been getting enormous subsidies through green energy and all that stuff. So this has become a big part of his job, and this is the difference between a monarch and a politician. It occurs to me that in a monarchy, you don't really have politicians. In a democracy, you have politicians who are all sort of like acting in order to get your consent. So, there's definitely something to the politicization of companies that's happening right now.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a very important point, that the very existence of politics as a profession is premised on property being stolen effectively. Because again, in a monarchy where it's just like, this is mine, that's yours, the end, there's no parading or acting that needs to go on to try and deceive you into something, because the lines are just very clear. Whereas in the democratic model, there's just such a blurring, and this is occurring to me kind of as we've gone through this conversation, but I think Hoppe has just done such an excellent job of spelling this out. What then? So we were going to talk a little bit about tariffs and taxes. How is that related to this ordeal? I assume tariffs became more of a substantial issue as we started to globalize maybe during and post World War I, World War II.
Well, so the transition, I think, is interesting, because early on in the U.S.'s history, federal government was funded almost entirely by customs duties, tariffs, right? Like it was, whatever, and that made sense because they controlled the borders, and whatever was coming into the United States, they would just tax. The Merchant Marine was one of the first organizations in the federal government, and they were collecting duties basically. This was the way in which you got going in a democracy, and those are some of the first taxes. What ended up happening is as you had more democracies, this became kind of a model. Like under a monarchy, you have essentially justification to tax almost anything. Of course, like democracies now tax whatever, right? But it used to be that king would tax commerce at a certain place or something to that effect. But sales taxes were kind of unknown, right? Like for a long time, and it was really only sort of like like within certain like markets or whatever that you would be able to impose those. The thing about democracies that with tariffs in particular is at least pre-fiat money, this was the major way to tax. And what this does is it decreases productivity because you don't have as many trade partners and you don't have as many options. So if you have two countries that have tariffs, and this could happen in a monarchy, but I think it's exacerbated in a democracy with tariffs because you have domestic producers who are going to be lobbying the government. And they and because they have sort of like a stake in it, they can convincingly argue, okay, you should raise the tariffs for this, so that we're protected as a constituency. And this is part of this whole welfare discussion that we're talking about, is you essentially end up subsidizing certain things, and it's not necessarily the most efficient, and that sort of impinges on prosperity. So when you have a bunch of democracies without fiat money, this tends to be it. And it turns out that was actually the case in a lot of places pre-World War II, and it caused all sorts of animosity. And a lot of democratic places, U.S. being a chief one, had a lot of that. And England was actually one of the few that didn't have tariffs, and they got to be very rich as a result of that. And to be fair, it wasn't because they were all like Adam Smith laissez-faire economics or whatever. It was because they had all these colonies and they needed trading partners for those, and they were trying to make it more efficient and so on. So there was some selfish reasoning to do that. But when you have more trading partners and less tariffs, it does end up with more prosperity. But because democracies tend to sort of protect their own, and your constituency is within your borders, it reduces the prosperity of the entire world in a sense. Now, that's not to say that authoritarian governments or monarchies or whatever don't do the same thing. They certainly can. US's tariff war with China, I think is sort of evidence that it can definitely happen with non-democratic countries as well. But there is that element of it in absence of fiat money. But once you get fiat money, then you can just sort of tax your populace and not have to do tariffs. And this is where we get that. And this is something that I honestly think about under a Bitcoin standard. I think you start seeing more tariffs again, right? Like I think you do start seeing that as becoming a bigger part of nation's tax arsenal or whatever. And I'm not so sure it's that terrible, because certainly under the gold standard there were all sorts of tariffs, but people managed to prosper. But it is sort of like a lesser evil than fiat money, certainly. But it is there, and it is something that I think democracies are maybe a little bit more susceptible to than monarchies.
Yeah, so it's because I guess democracies are controlling larger perimeters, so larger borders, that they're, I guess they tend to impose higher tariffs than a monarchy, where monarchies would be inherently more decentralized.
Well, so for a democracy, you have to listen to your constituents, right? The people that they tend to have a larger voice than, say, the rest of the public that might benefit from the imports or whatever. And a monarch can kind of see that and just say no. Whereas in a democracy, it's much harder to say no. And you have fluctuating tariffs and things like that because depending on who's in power. So that is a part of the tax base of democracy, because it's the easiest one to impose. The easiest one by far is fiat money, right? Like just print as much as possible. But the second easiest, I think, is tariffs, because it doesn't come from your citizens, and you can at least make that argument.
Right.
This is one where democracies are particularly susceptible, and because of the property boundaries being very blurred, you tend to look for some like that is kind of a clear property boundary, and a blurred property boundary thing is getting money from
coming from the outside
of the country.
Yeah. So then so this is the lobbying mechanism is just more effective inside of a democracy then. So
yeah,
can put up higher walls effectively because stakeholders inside the country are trying to protect their own interests from, or protect their own markets from outsiders.
Yeah, and they usually demand some sort of subsidies of some kind if the tariffs are not there. And this is where you get sort of corporate welfare, is that in order to support U.S. car manufacturers, for example, like to be competitive with foreign autos, you end up subsidizing them significantly. And that you get weird incentives like that, where tariffs are essentially substituted with corporate welfare, and that's sort of like the path that you end up going down with fiat money, where it might reverse a little bit. Maybe we go to tariffs, and then we reduce the state enough that tariffs are unnecessary. I don't know. So
that's an interesting thought that tariffs would become a larger component of tax revenue under a Bitcoin standard, because typically tariffs would kind of be quid pro quo, right? Like if you enforce a tariff on me, I'm probably going to enforce one back on you. And there's this kind of game of escalation. Do you think then that Bitcoin standard could actually increase the protectionism and divisiveness among nations in that way?
Yeah, I think early on, definitely. I can definitely see that, because governments are going to be starving for revenue, and they're going to need it. And this is obvious. This is the obvious easy one. This is a very easy win, because essentially you say, well, we're not taxing you. Of course, your goods are going to be more expensive.
Right.
But it's not as obvious that it's hurting the people on the inside. So in a democracy, especially, I think you see, certain places, instead of like ethanol subsidies in Iowa, for example, you start taxing, imported ethanol or something to that effect, as a way to equalize. They amount to the same thing, but it's less of a pernicious tax, like that's over everybody. That's subsidizing it. Instead, it's the people that are using ethanol that are subsidizing it, and in which case they hopefully will lobby and show that they're doing it more efficiently and so on. And it's hard to I think that's basically the pattern that corporate welfare goes, is that it turns from direct subsidization to some sort of tariff.
It's particularly pernicious because the tariff is actually destroying the division of labor and wealth creation, right? So if that game just keeps escalating upward, everyone suffers effectively.
It does, but it's not quite as bad as corporate welfare, because you specifically choose like a winner and a loser with corporate welfare. But at least you have to do it at sort of like the industry level with the tariff.
Right.
In a sense, I would argue that tariffs are better than this sort of fiat based subsidization of everything. No tariff, I think, is best, because then you have more trading partners, and each country does, or each person in each country does what they do best. But like, it's weird because I have different views on this, right? Under a fiat standard, I actually think tariffs are good. Under a Bitcoin standard, I think tariffs are bad. And this can be kind of a weird thing, but under a fiat standard, what ends up happening is you do subsidize like specific companies instead of tariffs. So tariffs, then like at least like the best companies in your own country survive instead of a specific company that's politically connected.
Right.
So,
yeah. So tariffs are better than inflation, especially on the other side of inflation being corporate welfare, zombie companies, winners and losers and all that. But it's still not ideal, right? From an economic, purely economic standpoint. To your point, tariffs are an obvious next step. Governments are going to be starving for revenue. Inflation gets closed out as a revenue option as a consequence of Bitcoin over time, theoretically, largely. Would real estate be next? Like governments just taxing, commercial and residential real estate more heavily?
Yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, they do to a large extent already. I think a lot of local government expenditure is funded by real estate taxes. I'm sure that's true all over the world. And it's I think Rothbard says it's one of the easiest things to tax because it doesn't move.
That's right.
Like,
you can't conceal
exactly
it,
where it is. Yeah. So it's very easy to tax. So it is taxed to a large extent already. I think consumption taxes are probably a little bit easier, but it's hard to like sales tax is probably a much easier tax than something like an income tax because it's hard to know how much a person is earning unless you have a CBDC or something like that.
Right.
So yeah, real estate is property, so you can tax it, and I'm sure they'll lean on it a little more. I would like to see the federal government sell off a lot of the land that it owns because it doesn't do anything with it.
Right.
There's just so much of it that could probably be put into much better private use, but there's this weird public ownership of this land that's just odd. And I think the U.S. could actually pay off a lot, keep. We have way too many government employees, for example, right? So a way in which you can do that is sell off public land and make sure that they get what was promised to them, right? If they have a pension or whatever, sort of sunset them, but don't hire any new ones. That way you can have a smoother transition to a Bitcoin standard by using, land as funding or something to that effect. And I mean, there's literally probably trillions of dollars in real estate value that the U.S. government owns that could probably be used for much better purposes and cause a lot more prosperity instead of just sort of sitting out there as wasteland for I don't know, nuclear waste or something like that.
Do you think that makes sense too, that the ascent of Bitcoin could actually cause governments to start to sell off some of their public lands? To your point, they're starving for revenue. You see that happening as well?
Yeah, I hope so. I can't see so I expect under a Bitcoin standard for the private sector to be thriving because you can save, you can start new businesses and stuff like that. So there's going to be a demand for stuff like land that the government owns, and sort of putting it into private hands so that they can fund whatever it is that they want seems like a natural sort of high time preference thing a government might do. So, if it without the spigot of money printing, that seems like a fairly good revenue source. Now you can of course tax real estate, but that's another tax. People usually hate taxes, and that's going to cause an uproar. But if you can sort of keep it going by selling some land or even leasing the land, or making better use of the resources that the government has, I think ultimately it ends with a lot more prosperity because more people will be able to do certain things. Maybe they start grazing lions in some of that land or something, and we start doing something interesting with lions. I don't know. There's all sorts of ways in which you can use land that we're not really exploring because entrepreneurship is expensive, and there isn't as much available as there should be because the federal government just kind of owns it. So but that's not just land, right? There's a lot of other stuff that the federal government owns that they could be selling that they aren't.
Well, that's a really potentially positive outcome, in my opinion, just because again, getting that land back into the hands of private owners sees that it's put to its highest and best economic use. Whereas right now, to your point, it sits there, idle more or less. So it sounds like, again, this is maybe another aspect of Bitcoin kind of pushing back on government in a way, putting government back to its roots of like control the borders, guard the land. You can tax the real estate, but you're not going to have inflation as a revenue source. Sales tax is interesting because it gets murky, right? Depends on what you're buying and where you're buying it from. If you're buying just digital stuff in a digital marketplace, I think on a Bitcoin standard, that would be pretty hard to tax. But if you're buying stuff at the local grocery store, maybe that's a little bit easier. So that's a really interesting way to look at it. Okay. Well, there's one. We went through chapter 1 of Democracy, the God That Failed here, and I think the final paragraph is so powerful. I just wanted to read it out. Hoppe says, ultimately, the course of human history is determined by ideas, whether they are true or false. Just as kings could not exercise their rule unless public opinion accepted their rule as legitimate, so democratic rulers are equally dependent on public opinion to sustain their political power. It is public opinion, therefore, that must change if we are to prevent the process of de-civilization from running its full course. And just as monarchy was once accepted as legitimate, but is today considered to be an unthinkable solution to the current social crisis, it is not inconceivable that the idea of democratic rule might someday be regarded as morally illegitimate and politically unthinkable. Such a delegitimation is a necessary precondition to avoiding ultimate social catastrophe. It is not government, monarchical or democratic, that is the source of human civilization and social peace, but private property and the recognition and defense of private property rights, contractualism, and individual responsibility. Very powerful. This reminds me of the end of human action, actually, where Mises says that, for most tools, the most useful tool is going to win out in the marketplace. But when it comes to the ideology or social system that we create for ourselves, that we organize ourselves within, that's not the case, right? It is very much decided in the court of public opinion. And so this, along with that quote from H.G. Wells, that education is a race between civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. These are like my two lightning bolt moments where I'm like, holy cow, we really have to educate people about the importance of Bitcoin and private property more generally. And, checks and balances, at least, if not minimization of government. And it just seems like we've strayed so far, it's incredible that we sit here in this seat of arrogance thinking we're, modern geniuses compared to our ancestors. But in fact, we've lost our way in so many respects.
Yeah, and democracy has sort of like become a god, right? Like it's sort of taken as an intrinsically good thing. And I don't think that's the case. I think we've shown over, 2 podcasts and 6 hours or something like that, that it's there are certain incentives in democracy that are completely antithetical to natural law. And it does sort of like allow for, mob rule, more war, fiat money, welfare state, all sorts of things that I think we would see as kind of bad. And the unfortunate reality is that, democracy has a lot of flaws, and it very well may be like what Hoppe says, that we may someday look back on it and say, how could anyone have done a democracy? Because it is clearly, draws very murky boundaries between public and private property, thus, violating a lot of natural law, which, hopefully is at least internal to most people. So, yeah, in a sense, like we've been propagandized about democracy, I think, and we're all sort of have a sense that it's intrinsically good when it's really not. There are flaws with it, especially with the incentive systems around it. But that said, like I don't know if something better will be tried necessarily. I think a very limited government, or even something like anarcho-capitalism, as is Hoppe's preference. I don't know if that's going to come about anytime soon. But in the meantime, I think we need to be aware of the cognitive biases that we might have towards democracy because of what we've been propagandized with, and recognize its realities, that it is very flawed, and that there are sort of tendencies towards fiat money, the welfare warfare state, and particularly in the absence of God, towards just unimaginable evil that is possible within this structure, because it can very easily lead to something like communism. So yeah,
excellent points. I'm reminded of, I don't know if you ever saw this on Twitter, but there was this sequence of local news anchors, and they were all reciting the same trope. They were like, it's very dangerous for our democracy. And they were, there was a whole spiel, but they were word for word repeating one another.
The same exact thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as we've touched on here, these ideologies wrap themselves in this moralistic camouflage that protects them in the court of public opinion. So how do we pierce that veil? Like because if you walked out, I'd say into anywhere in the US and you approached someone and said, democracy is a scam, I mean, I would think they would think you are crazy, right? Or some kind of crazy anarcho-capitalist or whatever. But how can we, because this is not an unsophisticated argument. Like this is pretty high brass intellectual argument to some extent. I mean, you need to understand time preference and these other factors. How can we pierce that veil of moralistic camouflage that democracy is wrapped in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suspect that we have to use the same tools of propaganda that have been used on us to make us believe that democracy is this amazing thing. I mean, there are people that have read this book and have started, talking about it as, okay, it's democracy isn't all that. I don't know. There needs to be better rhetoric, better memes, better ways of looking at it. I do suspect that younger people are much more open to that idea, and particularly in places on the internet that are not frequented by polite people like 4chan. This sort of idea is actually like, yeah, it's obvious that democracy is not all bad, and monarchies are probably better, and so on. But this is kind of how things change. It's not obvious to us now that democracy is has all these flaws. But maybe 50 years from now it will be obvious, and people will try something better based on the flaws that it has, hopefully from a priori thinking, right? Like from rationalistic perspective of, okay, what are the things that we're optimizing for? Well, it clearly does not optimize for these things, so therefore let's try something that will optimize for these things. And that's where I think we have to go. I think Bitcoin brings about something better, even within a democracy or monarchical framework. It just has that sort of like purifying element to it, because it makes money honest, and it takes away this great evil called fiat money that's used to oppress people by every government. So that's my hope, and we'll see, exactly how that will work. But I suspect that if you're going to convince people that democracy isn't all that, it has to start with the young people, and it's going to take at least a generation.
Well said. Well, Jimmy, thank you so much for joining me on this. I think this is extremely important material, and I hope this helps nudge the universe, hopefully a little bit away from democracy as the dominant feature of the 21st century.
No, I would love for it to be liberty and not democracy, because that's ultimately what it's about.
Amen to that. All right. Thank you so much.